Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Putting the Truth Back into True Crime with FearNothing-QuestionEverything. This is episode 5, and in this episode I'm going to discuss Cruz, Moscow PDs initial suspect in the Idaho killings. We'll explore his suspicious past and how his alibi's vehicle matched the vehicle law enforcement were looking for, but police had decided to zero in on Brian before the IgG results were even close to coming in, so it doesn't appear to have even been looked into any further. This episode shouldn't be that long. Thanks for tuning in. If you like this kind of content, please give me a like and subscribe to my channel. Let's begin. Cruz was a resident of Pullman, Washington. Initially, I had said he was a neighbour of Brian Koberger. After further research, I've realised that he wasn't a direct neighbour of Brian Koberger, but instead, he was the neighbour of a house that was broken into in Washington in 2021. I'll discuss this a little bit later in the episode. Spanish was Jose's first language, and he spoke broken English. In 2017, Jose was charged with attempted murder after stabbing the mother of his child 8 times. When law enforcement officers arrived, he was carrying their baby, whilst the woman lay in the parking lot with 8 stab wounds to her upper body. Although I wish I could provide further information on this crime, but it seems impossible to find. I'm unsure if that's related to me being in the UK or if it just isn't readily available, which is strange because I don't usually struggle to find anyone else's information. Anyway, we can confirm that whatever punishment he did receive for the crime, it was less than 4 years in prison because by October 2021, Jose was residing in Pullman. Also, I want you to note, in 2017, Jose was also accused of going into a neighbour's house and watching her sleep. This is only briefly touched on in the Pullman police reports, so I can't offer you any more information on this either, other than it happened and the police have a record of it. Fast forward to 2021, Jose lives in Pullman. 3:29am, police are called to a home in Pullman where an ex-sorority student reported someone breaking into her house and entering her room in the middle of the night. The suspect was wearing a burgundy ski mask and had a knife in his right hand. He was described as being around 5'3". He approached the student's bed and she kicked him in the stomach, causing him to stumble back onto the wardrobe and flee the scene. The girl instantly ran to one of her roommates to tell them what happened and to wait for police to arrive, as you would expect anyone to do when there's a masked intruder in your home. But anyway, police arrived at the scene at 3:33am. During this period, they explained that their neighbour, Cruz, often smoked, and where he stood to smoke, he could see inside her window. This prompted police to go and speak to Cruz. When they spoke to him, he explained that night he worked, went to the bar with his friend and spent the night at his friend Miguel's house. When police spoke to Miguel, he told them they worked, went to the bar and that he dropped Jose off back at his apartment around 2:30am. When Jose was confronted with this conflicting information, he blamed it on the language barrier and said that's not what he meant to say. However, despite this, it doesn't appear Cruz was ever charged with the crimes. Pullman PD and Moscow PD later considered Brian as a suspect in those crimes, despite him not being in the area at the time or for a further 9 months afterwards, and him also not matching the suspect description. Fast forward to November of 2022, Moscow PD have a vehicle that they believe travelled from Pullman and back and committed 4 homicides in Moscow in between. It's important to note that they think they can't prove. I already went into that with the vehicle's movements. However, Jose became their suspect. Although Moscow PD never confronted Jose and interviewed him about the homicides, instead they took 2 cigarette butts that he had discarded during observation and sent them to the lab. Moscow PD were initially looking for a white, tan or silver sedan. One of the markings that they mentioned stood out in the description was the shark fin type antenna at the back of the vehicle. When law enforcement were discussing the vehicle in the email thread, an officer emailed in that Cruz's alibi for the night had just so happened to drive a silver Hyundai Sonata, and it closely resembled an 11-13 Hyundai Elantra. Upon looking up the make and model of the vehicle, I also learned that vehicle had a shark fin type antenna. I want to note that when he's mentioning speaking to Cruz and him having an alibi, I'm not certain whether he's talking about on the 12th or the 13th of November, or whether or not he's discussing his alibi from the October suspected crime. Anyway, when the lab processed Cruz's DNA, it didn't match any of the DNA present at the crime scene. I've edited it here to add that Jose Cruz's DNA was only ever tested against the DNA on the sheath. So, although I say it wasn't present at the crime scene, it was never tested against the rest of the unknown male DNA as far as this forensic report indicates. I'll continue. However, neither did Brian Koberger's DNA. Jose's alibi, or his friend's DNA, was never taken. Jose was never interviewed further, and I don't believe the alibi's vehicle was ever looked into further either. However, what we do have here is a man who has previously stabbed a woman multiple times in her upper body, who was known previously to enter a woman's house throughout the night to watch her sleep. More than once, by the way. We have him also suspected of entering a woman's house with a knife, wearing a balaclava at 3:30 a.m, or a ski mask even. We have his friend, apparent alibi, who drives a vehicle that an officer thought matched the description of the Idaho suspect vehicle. We have him living in Pullman, but we can't place him at the crime. Then we have an older student, vegan, no past criminal history of violence, and certainly no history of harming any females. He may have made them a little uncomfortable with his mannerisms, but that's typical with autism. He also had ADHD and OCD, and a former opiate addiction that he managed to beat. A man who had literally turned his life around and was working towards a PhD in criminology with the hopes of entering the criminal justice field, who we also can't place at the scene. Trace touch DNA doesn't do that. Again, the only thing they can prove is that Brian touched a sheath, but there was also unknown DNA on the sheath that didn't match Brian's or any of the victims. And of course, in true state of Idaho law style, law enforcement failed to identify the source. I'll leave you with that. If there's anything you would like me to discuss a wee bit further or go into in the next episode that you'd like to understand a wee bit better, then please leave a wee suggestion in the comments. Thank you. Bye. See you next time.